Okay, hello everybody and good afternoon. It's very nice to see all friendly faces today with us at IPC. Now we have a wonderful speaker with us today, and I am so happy to be introducing him. He came all the way from Sao Paulo. In fact, his plane arrived about 2 hours ago. Can you believe it? He just came with a 15-hour flight and at IPC. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And he is, of course, a professor who will be talking to us about an extremely important topic, which I'm sure is on the minds of many in the room today, well, all of us, basically what is happening to the international order. Is it unraveling? Yes, but in which direction? And what are the different perspectives from different parts of the world about the transformation or the changes that are happening in the existing order? And Dawisson will, of course, provide us with a Brazilian perspective, which I'm sure we're all very eager to hear. Now, let me just introduce him to you a bit more for those of you who might not know him so well. Dawisson Belém Lopes, I hope I did not massacre your name. He's a professor of international and comparative politics at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And a research fellow of the National Council for Technological and Scientific Development in Brazil. From 2018 to 2022, he served as the UFMG's, that is the university's, Deputy Dean for International Affairs. He has authored, edited 11 books and dozens of peer-reviewed articles on topics related to Latin American politics, Brazilian foreign policy, and international institutions. He was also previously a visiting researcher at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, a visiting professor at the Catholic University of Louvain in Mons. He was a Raisana Young Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, which I also worked with in the past. He's a Susi Scholar on Foreign Policy at the University of Delaware and a visiting academic at the University of Oxford's Latin American Center. And he has already given lectures at the invitation of 8 national governments and the United Nations and delivered presentations or published his articles in 30 different countries. Wow. Okay. So, Dawisson, without further ado, I think would like to now give the floor to you to hear more about the emerging, unraveling international order and the Brazilian view of how the order is and where it should be going and what should middle powers like Brazil do about it. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sanem. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. And I'm so grateful to each one of you for taking the time to see what I'm going to tell you about Brazil, such a far off, distant place from Turkey. It's really an honor to be here and to stand before you today. I just want to acknowledge the presence of my fellow compatriot, Ambassador Rui Amaral, who is a very high-ranking diplomat from my country, and who is serving now in Istanbul. Lucky him, he's got this position in Istanbul, and who's come to have this conversation with us this afternoon. Thank you, Rui, very much for your kind presence in the room today. So I'll just go to the pulpit to start my talk. I want to thank Sabancı University, and particularly the Istanbul Policy Center in the person of Professor Sanem, for having me today, this afternoon in Istanbul. So I'm not sure I know how to deal with this machine.
My colleagues will help.
It's easier than I thought. I mean, it looks a bit daunting at
Don't
first.
Worry. Even I can manage it.
It's really easy. So, okay, yes, the topic of our conversation today is the emerging world order. And I'll try to provide you with a Brazilian, not the Brazilian perspective, but a Brazilian view, a Brazilian perspective even if sometimes it overlaps with the Brazilian official position, but it's not meant to be a Brazilian official account. It's just an academic view of what is going on in the world today and how I feel it, how I interpret the latest developments. So just to refer to the title, there's a, the Unravelling World Order, the idea that there's something on the move. We are witnessing the ground shaking beneath our feet. That's the idea. We try to make sense of the world today as we are defied, as we are faced with lots of difficult new situations. That's the idea I want to explore over this presentation. The geopolitical cleavages, the divisions that are coming to the fore, and how emerging powers like Turkey or Brazil or India or South Africa have been dealing with this new situation. That's what the talk is all about. That's what the talk's meant to be about. So there's one good metaphor to catch the idea that I wanted to explore this afternoon. The metaphor has been employed before by historians, the Roaring Twenties, as an allusion to the 20th century 20s, the 1920s, and the way those years, that particular decade, has been transformative, has changed the world as we know it today. So possibly we are now experiencing new Roaring 20s, now the 2020s. The time has come for us to try to make sense of it all, to come to terms with this global situation. And as the metaphor has been employed before, I think it's useful and appropriate to describe what's taking place in the world today. The new Roaring 20s, meaning that events such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ukraine war, the war in Gaza, and all else. Of course, there are many more events taking place in South Asia, in Africa, across the world. They represent possibly a new era of international relations. So possibly we are witnessing a very new moment, which will re-signify the ways in which we apprehend international relations. That's my plan. And why so? So trying to set the stage, or jokingly, as I put it, set fire to the stage. There are some landmarks that are easily associated with this, the shaking grounds and the transformation we are now witnessing. First and foremost, 9/11, the terrorist acts carried out early in the 21st century in the United States soil, they have been very transformative. They have changed the ways in which we see the civilizational contestation, the dispute for values. That was such a game changer, in my view. 9/11, it's been almost 25 years now, and the world was definitely transformed by those terrorist acts. Terrorism became such a topic on everyone's agenda, and the idea that there were some other civilizational projects or civilizational worldviews other than the Western dominant hegemonic worldview
that was in a very abrupt way shown to all of us. There were some other ways to grapple with the world's tensions, the world's challenges, and that in a very violent way that suddenly came out the moment those terrorist acts were carried out. So I believe 9/11 represents well those new civilizational disputes, those value clashes that now are all pervasive. When one looks around in the 21st century, it's all taken by civilizational disputes. Possibly the landmark is 9/11. Then, from an economic perspective, the 2008 financial crisis, which has literally brought the world down, financial markets down, in a question of matter of a few days, lots of bankruptcies around the world. Countries were desperate, trying to figure out, to understand what was going on in the world. And those early financial crisis days were also pedagogical in what? They have signaled the potential distress caused by financial markets interconnectivity, and how the absence of instruments to deal with those circuit breakers was detrimental to the world as a whole. So those were very complicated days and months and years, and we had to deal with the legacies of 2008 financial crisis for a lot of time. From a Brazilian perspective, in the beginning, I still remember Brazil's president then saying it was not a big deal. Right? It was not a tsunami. It was just a small wave, and it would not hit Brazil hard. But it just took some more time. But the wave, the gigantic wave, then came to Brazil as well as the rest of the developing world. And that was complicated for us to, that has led my country to lots of different crises in a variety of categories and dimensions. So we had to grapple with it, even if a bit later, but we had to absorb the giant, the great impact of the world's financial crisis as well. So my take here, the 2008 financial crisis has changed once and for all the world's economic settings. Then 2014 Crimea's annexation by Russia. That was also, and let me be clear when I say this, it was not the first time in the history of mankind a country has invaded another. Of course not. History of humankind is all pervaded, it's all could be told with reference to all those events in which one country goes inside another by way of force. It happens all the time in the course of history. But this time it was different. There was a different feeling. Because when one looks back to the 20th century, one easily identifies all the diplomatic work that was carried out in order to make this kind of aggressive move worse, to make them anachronistic, to make them not the rule, but the exception instead. The 20th century was to some extent, to some degree, successful in changing the mindsets of countries and in making war such an obsolete, I mean, classic interstate war, to make it clear, not to be mistaken. So classic interstate war, by the end of the 20th century, was seen as something kind of, out of the menu. It was not part of the country's repertoire anymore by the end of the 20th century. But then again, suddenly, violently, that has come back. Conquest wars have made a comeback. And in all probability, I would claim, the Russian move in Crimea could be identified as an important landmark in my personal timeline, okay? It's not like a consensus, but for me, it is representative of a more general tendency, which of course has come to the peak in 2022. Ukraine war is, of course, the most prominent and salient version of this kind of geopolitical move. But if we look back, we see that the annexation of Crimea was already in itself very representative of a new modality of a geopolitical move. So the invasion of countries was back. It's definitely back by 2014. And then, also very important, to account for this transformation of the world, 2016, I say Trump plus Brexit momentum. Again, neither Donald Trump nor the Brexit or Boris Johnson, they were not themselves inept. There have been many other political, charismatic, populist figures in the history of the world, in the history of states. Populist leaders were already around. Extremist leaders were already around. But the thing is, there was a culmination of this process, apparently, because it was so visible. We are speaking of the one superpower in the world, the US, and a former superpower, the UK. It was very representative of a new mood, a new state of mind in the world. So if 9/11 represented new civilizational disputes, if the 2008 financial crisis represented the emergence of a truly very interconnected world, one in which financial markets were central. If the 2014 event in Crimea represented this geopolitical return of invasions of countries, annexations of countries, then, if I'm right, the 2016 momentum represented the return or the instantiation of this new mood from a domestic perspective. So extremism became the order of the day. Electors, voters were not afraid of pursuing extremist solutions any longer. Anywhere in the world, it applies to the US, the UK, to Brazil, or to any other country, you name it. There was a new momentum. Populism was alive and kicking. And the extreme right has become mainstreamed That's such an interesting, from an observer's perspective, from an academic perspective. They made it. I mean, they left the French, they came to the center, they came to the stage and started dictating how politics should be from then on. So this is the new stage. This is the new world scene. And this is, in a way, those are the antecedents, those are the facts that have enabled the roaring 2020s. So this came before. Well, in this admirable, brave new world, some countries have emerged, arguably. Speaking of Brazil, Turkey, India, South Africa, and many others. And not just in a symbolic way, because one could claim that back in the 1950s and 60s, when there was a decolonization of African and Asian nations, there was kind of a coordinated movement from the global South. I know I'm employing an anachronistic category. There was no global South talk back in the 1960s, but you know, countries, underdeveloped countries, or countries that were pursuing higher stages of development. Back then, they were represented under the G77 umbrella or the non-aligned movement umbrella. They had a voice already, and that's allegedly, I mean, they were already able to voice out their concerns. And I think this is right, this is correct. What I find not to be correct is to attribute to the 1960s non-aligned movement or to the 1960s G77 any kind of geopolitical agency. They lacked agency. They lacked the ability to intervene, to change the course of the game. What's different now? This set of countries I have just listed, they have more muscle. They are stronger. They have more capacity. They have more ability to change the game, to change the course of international affairs. There was an impressive deconcentration of power over the last decades. And one can measure this. It's not just lip service. It's not just impressionistic views. If you look at those databases that are dedicated to state capabilities, it's easy to identify this, especially in the realm of economic affairs, this big concentration. From the North Atlantic, the axis has been dislocated to Eurasia. That was a huge change. The rise of Asia, the spread of nuclear capabilities. Of course, when we think of nuclear politics today, we're not speaking of the original 5 detainees of nuclear warheads. We're speaking of definitely a larger group of countries. But there's more. Countries like Brazil with environmental credentials. They're hard to dispute. If one wants to talk sustainability today, it's necessary to invite Brazil. Brazil should be in the room, be it for its biodiversity, be it for its hydroelectric, forest resources, or for the fact that Brazil is, as The Economist magazine once put it, Ambassador, the barn of the world. We provide food to the world to a very large degree. We keep shipping our soybeans and meat to China all the time, every day. So when it comes to the global environmental governance, a country like Brazil is such an important stakeholder, one of the most important ones in the world. But not only this, there's the exuberant Middle Eastern finance, or the power to be African continent with its demography and the promise that it represents for the world, the African continent. There's a lot more. So what do I mean? We have different poles, we have different sites in the world which are representative of a particular kind of clout, of power. So there's hardly today the kind of ambience, the kind of environment that one would find in the world by the 1950s, 1960s. For me, one figure suffices. The US, in the late 1940s, the US would account for roughly 45% of the globe's GDP. In the end, in the late 1940s, 45% of the world's GDP. Today, the US barely accounts for 25%. So this in itself represents this huge concentration of power. There's a lot more to it, but from this perspective, one can already feel the change. Then, those emerging middle powers have felt the need to come up with a grouping, with an organization of countries that would allow for something more, for some bolder moves in the international scenery. In the early 21st century, 4 countries, namely China, India, Brazil, and Russia, have decided they could make what previously was seen just as a set of emerging markets, good for profit. They could be transformed into a geopolitical agency. And that took place in 2008. So by 2008, they have agreed, and in 2009, in Russia, formally inaugurated the BRIC grouping: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And they were eventually joined by South Africa, 2011. So by 2011, there was the BRICS, the original, the founding BRICS: Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa. This grouping of countries has hibernated for some time, as Brazil, Russia, South Africa especially were grappling with some internal crisis. So it was hard for the grouping to find a consistent path and a common denominator. But I'll claim that in the 2020s, then momentum came back, and they have again found the BRICS to be a useful platform for emerging nations. But the thing is, it's not the BRICS we used to know anymore. There's a new BRICS grouping now, as the grouping has been joined by a set of 6 other nations, all of them regional powers, emerging middle powers, with a variety of stakes in international affairs. So I'm speaking of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and Indonesia. All of them, and for different reasons, all of them with some degree of leverage in international affairs. Each one of them can come up with tentative moves and can change the course of events, even if in a very particular niche area. But they have leverage. That's what has changed since the early beginnings of the BRICS grouping. So now, in terms of population, they have reached a very impressive threshold. They account for, barely half of the world's population, and more than 40%. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of manpower. It's a huge economic market, all combined, half of the world. Only 11 countries, but they account for barely, roughly half of the world's population, not to mention their economic power. So when measured by parity, purchase power parity, I'm sorry, it is quite eloquent, the ways in which they can, again, be successful in their bids and be useful to lead, to steer the world's development. That has changed quite a lot, in my view. But what matters the most for me is the way, and that was kind of unfolding before our eyes over the last 5 years, the ways in which the global South has reinvented itself and has become a collective actor. Of course, it's heterogeneous. Yes, it is. One can never think of a bunch of countries, like 140 countries, that would act in an absolutely coordinated way. It's impossible. That's not what we're talking about. But what seems to me to be indisputable is the ability those countries have developed to move and to interact with each other, amplifying their presence in the world. And now I'm preparing to land. So this is, I'm already speaking of the roaring 2020s. A moment I think is full of eventful cases. The first one being the COVID-19 pandemic. From a comparative politics professor, it was a banquet, because one could compare any country in the world with any other country in the world. How country X would respond to the crisis, while country Y would refuse to provide societal responses to the very challenging situation of a pandemic. So I think it was very telling It was one of the most pedagogical moments we will ever live, you know, in the span of our lifetime. It was really an important moment for each one of us. And what could we learn with regard to the behavior of the global north, of the northern hemisphere? One thing, they were not solidary to the countries in the global south. One could feel it, and one can still hear this kind of account coming from African countries, for instance. While countries in the northern hemisphere were quick in finding technical solutions to immunize their populations, to buy all the shots available, countries in Africa or Latin America were left to the back of the line, while countries like the US, the UK, have started immunizing their populations. In late 2020, African countries could only get their first vaccine doses by 2022. So this lack of solidarity was, in my view, this was a landmark. There is before and after. Countries like India, China, and Russia, in a very different way, they have manifested solidarity, even if the effectiveness of their help could be contested. But from a symbolic perspective, the first vaccine doses that arrived in Brazil would come from China. India would provide millions and millions of doses to the countries in the Indian Ocean, around the Indian Ocean, while Russia would cater to countries in Latin America like Mexico or Argentina. They have purchased vaccine doses from Russia. If it weren't for this kind of help coming from China, India, Russia, we would be in a worse, even worse situation, because the Brazilian situation was kind of a cautionary tale, what not to do when facing a pandemic. We should do the other way. Brazil was not a good example when it comes to handling a pandemic. But again, that was, in my view, decisive for this cleavage between the global north and the global south to become visible, to erupt once and for all. The global pandemic we have all survived, all of us. But there's more to it. There's the Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine. So if the pandemic was representative of the lack of solidarity, lack of global solidarity, the war in Ukraine was also very telling with regard to the global north's proneness to engage in a war that would have meant sacrifices from an economic perspective to the global south. And they kept pressuring all the way, and they still do. They still put pressure on countries from the global south. So they can bandwagon, they can adopt sanctions, embargoes, pressure on Russia, but possibly for the first time in the history of at least Latin America. This is the kind of, that's the region I kind of master, whose politics I kind of understand. It was in all probability, the first time in our history, when we could stand for our own interests. We could secure supply chains. We did not embrace the others' interests, but ours. I think it was also a landmark in this regard. Because a country like Brazil, even when condemning Russia's illegal move, and Brazil has condemned it loud and clear, a country cannot invade another, never. But that's kind of a rule of thumb. You can never do it under any circumstance in the eyes of international law. But still, Brazil has refused to impose sanctions on Russia because had Brazil done it, that would be self-detrimental. And I'll explain you why, because Brazil relies on Russia's fertilizers, Belarus fertilizers. And as you all know, Brazil is a huge commodity exporter. With no fertilizers, and Brazil is not self-sufficient in fertilizers, there will be no crops. There will be no money flowing. That would be a huge problem in terms of food security, in terms of social welfare. The interruption of relations with Russia would have meant a big blow to Brazil's national interest. So the Brazilian diplomatic corps had to find a way to negotiate and to balance values and principles with very immediate, direct interests. It was tough. It was not easy. But I guess we have found a way which is consistent with Brazil's federal constitution, putting an emphasis on peace negotiations, the need to focus on diplomatic conversation, diplomatic negotiations. But the most important point for me is Brazil has resisted, not just Brazil, the global South has united and resisted. That was an important move. And to conclude, the Gaza conflict already is one of the deadliest in the recent history of mankind. According to the International Court of Justice, plausibly, there's a plausibility we are speaking of an ongoing genocide. And here I quote the ICJ, a plausible case for genocide. And what have the global South countries, what have they done? They have stood for Palestine. There might be some neutral countries, like I think India has been more or less neutral, and some other nations, but the vast majority of global southern nations have embraced the Palestinian cause, have rallied around the flag and supported the Palestinian case. This becomes even more evident if you look at the ICJ's case filed against Israel by South Africa, and supported by countries like Indonesia and Brazil. That's an important move as well. So again, the global South is becoming like a bloc, still a heterogeneous bloc, of course. One can still find holes on the wall. There are some, leaks. but they are starting to act as a single unitary political actor in some domains, not in every domain. Of course, each country has its own particular interests, inclinations, approaches, but there are cases and thematic domains where they can find a common denominator and they can act together. This is the biggest change one who is my age is witnessing now. This is new. This is totally new. And what's the problem with it from a theoretical point of view? We are under-equipped to make sense of it. All important theory of international relations up to the moment, up to now, has not contemplated this scenario. So see how interesting this can be. When we look back and think of the golden generation of IR theory during the interwar period, there are just European names like Raymond Aron, Karl Goethe, Martin White, and the like. Germany, France, UK. Then comes the second generation of IR thinkers. You name them. Kenneth Waltz, Robert Cohen, Joseph Nye, who's just passed away. Even today's John Mearsheimer. All American. Of course, they are in a position to lecture. They're in a position to tell the world how the world works because they concentrate a lot of it. But then comes the global south. The time comes for us to get representation, to get heard. And who are our spokespersons? To be defined. There are quite a few prominent voices, like India's Amitabh Acharya, or Turkey's Ayşe Sarakol. Those that just occurred to me. But in the future, there should be more people from, an IR, with an IR background, from international relations, this field of knowledge, sharing their views with the world's interpreters. That's what we should pursue now. An update, as diplomats usually say, an aggiornamento, the Italian word for updating the mindset. It's time for us to come with new worldviews, new perspectives, and to integrate our different, plural, diverse backgrounds. So this is an important theoretical gap we must fill over the coming years. And to conclude now, there's one very helpful concept put forth by UK's LSE's Dawisson. He refers to this process as deep pluralism. I like the idea that we still have a lot in common. It's still reasonable to speak of a global international society, because after all, there is a diplomatic network. People have conversations. We have international organizations. We have international law. We have practices and values that are widely shared and disseminated around the world. But still, it's time for a revision of this package of values and practices in order to incorporate what has been left aside, out of this package before. So this is what Professor Dawisson means by a deep pluralism, the deep values underpinning our international society must get an update, must be updated in order to be representative of our latest endeavors. Our theories must evolve to include multipolarity and the diverse perspectives stemming from the global south. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this
Great pleasure.
very comprehensive overview of where we are today and about the need to recognize the voices of the global south and how the international balances have been changing to the favor of the global south and towards more multipolarity in the international system, which requires maybe novel lenses to analyze them. Okay, now I'd like to open this up for discussion since we have an audience. So let me just ask the audience if anybody would like to pose any questions or make any comments. Yes, Sarah.
I have two big questions. First of all, like Turkey, Brazil has also experienced democratic backsliding. I'm wondering that how internal problems of Brazil influence its foreign policy, has influenced its foreign policy. Secondly, you have mentioned the norms and values which has been provided by these BRICS countries, especially when it comes to Gaza issue. But when we are talking about the West nowadays, we are always talking about forgetting of these norms and values. So do you think that these countries can be another alternative, especially as the crisis in Iran is unfolding? So what do you think in these two issues? And maybe last question, what are the concrete impact of these BRICS policies in Brazil foreign policy? You have mentioned, but I believe if you have anything.
Maybe if you'd like to directly
Yes,
respond to
very,
that.
very good ones, comprehensive questions. And the first one, maybe I'll be quicker to respond. The idea that democratic backsliding leads to some sort of disorganization of foreign policy. I mean, this is, I believe in this assumption. So it's important to organize a country internally so that this country can project its strength, its voice in the world. It's a must. It's a prerequisite. And Brazil has actually, and you're right, has been consumed by multiple crises over the last decade or so. Political institutional crisis. You remember Brazil's former president, Dilma Rousseff, she's been toppled, and very different political leanings have been, have political parties have come to the presidential palace, have taken up power, and so this huge contrast between the latest presidents of Brazil has meant a discontinuation of policies at a very basic level. And I'm not just referring to foreign policy. One of the words, the keywords in the academic world most quickly associated with Brazil's public policy is dismantling. The dismantling of public policies in a wide spectrum of domains, foreign policy included. So if there is this kind of tumultuous, this kind of radically changing scenario inside. One day you have a left-leaning government, the other day far right, and then the other day traditional right. It's hard to continue any policy. It's hard to find a way to put forth a consistent foreign policy. That applies to Brazil and to any other country in the world. So that's the point. I mean, Brazil has been consumed from the inside, political institutional crisis, the sanitary crisis. Wow. Looking back, Brazil was has had one of the most terrible managements of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people died, and it was absolutely disproportionate, the death toll in Brazil.
We did we published a comparative piece
You
comparing, yes, since you were mentioning comparisons on Brazil, Turkey, and South Korea, and basically on their responses to COVID, linking those responses and their effectiveness or non-effectiveness in the case of Brazil to state capacity.
Lovely.
And
excellent.
yeah, and so you might be interested. I'll send
Oh, sure. I'll trace it. Yeah.
send it to you.
But the thing is, yeah, so for your first question, I think that's what I think. Brazil hasn't been able to project its weight the way it should. And now we are slowly trying to keep the pace and trying to recover our standing in world affairs. As for your second and third questions, they revolve around the BRICS grouping, so I'll try to tackle them jointly. The BRICS grouping for Brazilians, there's a lot of prejudice about the BRICS in Brazil, to begin with. So people often mistake the BRICS grouping for some sort of a bunch of revolutionaries or communists or you name it. I mean, but it's kind of a bunch of rogue states, of pariah states. That's how the BRICS grouping is often depicted by Brazilian mainstream outlets. That's hard to deal, that's hard to manage. You know, I imagine from a diplomatic perspective, wow, it's difficult. You are all the time telling the people it's not exactly this. It's reliant on a very pragmatic grounds, since China is Brazil's #1 trade partner. You know, since Russia is a very important country for Brazil's imports. And so on, so forth. It's premised on very tangible things. So if Brazil wants to talk to China, just give it a call, and it's a shortcut. For a country like Brazil, medium-sized regional power, it's possibly the best shortcut to become to be at the high table of major powers in the world, to connect directly. It's a good platform, very useful one. So is it going to deliver long-lasting solutions for problems as complicated as the Iranian-Israeli current crisis? I don't think so. I don't think so. It works on a much more self-service basis now. It's much more topical. Could one day become kind of a security alliance, a collective security alliance? I don't think it's going to happen. It could be, but I don't think it's on the horizon. It's not. Even because India is inside. India is an ally to the US and to And India is not properly amicable to China. So you see, it's hard to think of a coalition of the willing involved in the BRICS grouping. The current membership, mind you, it could be expanded and become even more heterogeneous. So I don't think it's going to happen. It's not going to be useful in this kind of situation. It's much more topical. But it is pragmatic and it is effective in some domains. That's important to say. It's not purely symbolic. It's not purely abstract. The whole talk of de-dollarization, this is the big deal these days. That's an important move and a useful one as well. It's important for us to become less dependent on the US dollar. And it's not a matter of being anti-Americanist. No. But every investor, in order to secure, to hedge, to guarantee her funds, he or she will diversify the basket of currencies, the basket of investments. That's how it works. For investors, for countries, should it be much different? I mean, we must have a diversity of currencies and of exchange modalities, not to become or to be taken hostage of one particular nation. That's how we see it. It's not being anti-Western, no, it's just being pro-Brazil. Being pro-global South, it's a totally different thing. I don't know if I'm missing something, but your questions were too good, too provocative. Thank you.
Maybe just for the sake of discussion, I could just say, I mean, I do agree that there are certain common objectives that loosely bind most of these states together. And one is, of course, this de-Westernization or hedging in the way of multipolarity, because the more you have multipolarity in the system, the less influence that you have, or the declining influence of the United States in the system, the more that these countries feel like they can make the most of their relations with other actors like China or like, you know, other middle powers or Russia or this and that. But I also feel that those middle powers that are authoritarian also have certain commonalities to them as well. Now, how unique it is to authoritarian middle powers, I don't know. Brazil, of course, is not one of them. So I'm not referring to Brazil here. But for instance, India is increasingly one of them, despite its official claims that it's still the largest democracy in the world. We know that that's not how things are going inside the country. Turkey, of course, is one of them. And if you look at these authoritarian middle powers, then I think there are some commonalities, for instance, in terms of how they boost a lot their military and security sector, how they refrain less of taking part in more adventurous regional foreign policies, through which they can exert, they're not afraid to exert more, you know, put boots on the ground, for instance, or engage in more military conflict escalation kind of modes. So these are, and they can do so because there is less and less checks and balances at home as well, which makes it easier for them to do so. They are less engaged in rules-based multilateralism because their regime security might demand one thing, the next day the other, right? So I think there is perhaps some, you know, conceptual refining there that might need to be done, where domestic governance, I think, matters. The type of domestic governance might matter to the extent that perhaps, you know, those that are democratic might be expected to behave relatively differently than to those that are authoritarian middle powers. So, you know, some might be contributing perhaps to a more equitable order or to the establishment of one, whereas for others, it's more rhetorical, sort of, you know, basis for remaining in power, in other words, because, you know, that's their ultimate goal, to establish a certain regime and to keep it that way. And that might sometimes demand different kind of policy than expected conventional middle power foreign policy. So anyway, but those are just my musings in response to your question. But any other questions? Oh, wow, everyone. Okay. Amina, I think I saw you first. Yes, yes.
And for such an insightful discussion. So as BRICS expand, with Brazil being, promoting South to South solidarity, and as we are discussing previously, so India is pursuing strategic autonomy both with BRICS and, both with BRICS and the Western Link forums, for example, G7, and we have Quad, and also, European Union's trade partnerships. So how can India's dual role help redefine the theory to include rising / emerging or middle powers in shaping a truly multipolar order?
Okay. So I'll refer to Sanam's previous comments were so much interesting. And try.
I might be fully wrong. I don't know.
No, you are right. I'm afraid you're right. And then I'll try to refer to your nicely framed question. There's a price we pay for multipolarity in terms of global institutions, in terms of the functioning of our global apparatuses. We need to kind of modify those this machinery, the kind of structures that have been brought up in the aftermath of World War II. They have to be fully, rethought. They must undergo like an overhaul in order to encompass, in order to bring everybody on board, or everyone that matters, like India and Brazil and Turkey on board. But when we do so, if we work that out, if we try to like reframe global institutions in a more encompassing way, we might discover it is hard to move forward with the very same kind of values and institutions we used to worship and nurture. And liberal democracy is one of them. That's the problem. And please don't get me wrong. I'm enthusiastic about democracy. We Brazilians treasure democracy. Yeah, we are very proud of our young democracy.
And you are a democracy still.
We are.
Yeah.
Still. Despite all the problems we face.
The attacks, global
all
attacks
the
on
attacks,
democracy.
totally concur with you. We still are. We are proud of our democracy. We treasure our democracy. But on the other hand, I also believe in the inevitability of a new pattern of democracy to be put into practice, especially when it comes to interstate relations. And what I really think, the idea of exporting democracy to the world that has been put into practice before is totally out of the question now. Completely. Liberal democracy itself is undergoing a lot of difficulties on the internal front. Is US democracy today, as we talk, a good model for the world? Hardly. Many European nations are facing the same kind of difficulties internally. So it's difficult to point a finger to those countries in the global south and try to lecture about democracy. It's become more difficult. And why? Because democracy as we once knew it, democracy is what World War II victors made of it. back then, as I mentioned before, around 65% or 2/3 of global GDP were in the hands of the North Atlantic countries. They could do whatever they felt like doing. They could export democracy, liberal democracy. They could make it the rule of the world. They could construct the whole institutional international complex as we know it. I mean, comprising Bretton Woods institutions, UN, NATO, and more. All of those institutions that I have just cited, they date back to the 1940s, late 1940s. All of them have been built during those years. But again, democracy as a value, an international value, was for some time the byproduct of this hegemony exerted by the US in alliance with some European nations. Now it's harder to sustain, it's harder to afford for them. They have to accommodate such exotic global southern views stemming from Brazil or India or Turkey and this is very, very challenging. How to accommodate it and how to come up with a different pattern, a different concept, one that will not jeopardize democracy as because if democracy is completely different from what we got used to identifying with democracy as a set of practices, values that allow for political competitiveness, for public contestation, or for some civil rights. If it becomes something very different, it's not democracy anymore. So that's the kind of operation we are processing nowadays. How to accommodate different mindsets, democratic mindsets, like Brazil's or Turkey's or India's, without degenerating or without risking the very concept of democracy. That's a tough battle. And it's not purely semantic or no, it's a real problem. How to make it work in an entirely different scenario. I don't know, I don't have the answer. I wish I had. Thank you.
Micah, did you want?
Yeah, there's two questions. Thank you for this very inspiring series of thoughts. And yeah, first of all, on a conceptual basis, I feel that, I mean, everyone is talking about Global South, as you know, it's quite a fashionable concept in Brazil, but still, I mean, is there really an established view of what is Global South? I mean, what makes really become or what uniting all these countries around such a concept? I mean, is it a way of opening new channels for the unheard voices, or is it an effort just to decentralize this Western-centric world? What is its characteristics and how can we define it? I mean, for instance, if China and Russia is really part of Global South, or there is a Global East as well, you know, this is a kind of conceptual puzzle that I'm dealing with, and maybe your views could be quite clarifying on that. And the second question is more related to Brazilian foreign policy, which is known as being moderate, peaceful, and giving importance to negotiations rather than the securitization of issues so on and so forth. But it is also a kind of isolationist, right? For instance, I remember a student of mine in Brazil was saying that I noticed that I'm also Latin American. I noticed this part of my identity just in the university. So there is also a kind of isolationism from other Latin American Hispanic world as well, right? So is Brazilian foreign policy breaking this? Is it becoming much more active or engaging with other global South societies, and is the global South mobilization part of it?
Well, two wonderful
Yeah,
questions.
great.
Wonderful. First of all, the global South as a concept, it used to be a binary concept, meaning if there is a global South, there should be a global North. But recently, John Eikenberry has come up with this trinary division, right? Global East, Global North, Global South. In an article for International Affairs, the journal. And yes, well, I tend to take the Global South as a geopolitical concept. In so being, I'd rather employ it as a binary concept, even if we might be putting too much content inside this concept, because what matters the most from my perspective is the fact that the global North, as we once knew it, US plus Europe, they have to negotiate the terms of their relationship with the rest of the world. And this rest of the world includes China and Russia. So from a geopolitical viewpoint, and provided that internally the global South has a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of difference, but still, as a political bloc, they have been defying the hegemony of the US plus Europe bloc. That's what, for me, that's what's new, absolutely new. This attitude. They are in defiance. When you look at some particular issues, some issue areas like energy, or I don't know, those rare earths and critical minerals, they might even have the upper hand. Unbelievably as it might seem, I mean, the global South now is in a position to negotiate and to bargain. Look at China or India.
Africa.
Or Africa, even Africa. Yeah. Even Africa now is in a position.
Critical raw materials, of course.
Precisely.
Clean energy source.
So that's new, and that kind of defiance is what juxtaposes one bloc and the other, like the North and the South. Okay, you can go like, you can try to unbundle. I don't think it's much helpful, because there's kind of a theoretical assumption when you call China and Russia the global East. The underlying idea is they have no followers. They're all alone. They are different kinds of animals. But they have been, especially China, Russia in this regard has more difficulties in connecting to the outside world. But China, all of China's international placement is based on interconnectivity, being everywhere, connecting, like, you know, this Silk Route, the idea of Belt and Road Initiative. They try to spread their tentacles everywhere. So they haven't been left behind. It's just the opposite. They're leading another way of integrating, connecting societies around the world. So that's what I think about Eikenberry's threefold division. I think it fails to capture the ability of China to literally unite the world from the global south, departing from the global south, ending in the global south. It's unbelievable.
Maybe one way of looking at this distinction is through the fact that Russia and China are ultimately imperial, right, in their outlook in the world. So they want to expand their influence. They want to expand their presence in what they perceive as their natural hinterlands, which for Russia, of course, is the larger eastern neighborhood, and for China, of course, you know, South Sea Pacific and everything. So, and even beyond, right? Because it's a global player. Russia is a great power. Global power is, well, it has nukes, but then the rest of it is quite debatable, I think, right? So I think that kind of sets them apart from the other global South countries like Brazil, for instance, that does not have that kind of a foreign policy aspiration to expand, right? To get in different, or sort of to be a hegemon. It's, again, I'm not an expert, you guys are the expert in Brazil, but that kind of sets them apart, you know, and also for Turkey, you know, yes, Turkey wants to have more clout and influence in its sort of region, but it sort of wants to be also a bit kind of imperial, but that's also limited also by the capability, right? Of course, Russia has much more capability than Turkey, and this, of course, China has even more than that. So if we look at it from that perspective, maybe we can argue that Russia and China kind of have, you know, capability combined with an ideological and a historical kind of mission to expand and to retain their hinterlands, kind of. I don't know. I'm speculating, but maybe one can make a point as such and make a distinction as than the rest of the global south. No.
No, that's kind of
I don't know.
Absolutely arguable. Yeah.
Because I agree with you. I mean, China, of course, is everywhere. They're everywhere. But they're not doing it from the goodness of their heart, right? They're doing it to be, you know, to
that has
basically,
to be very clear.
Yeah.
And I think the Brazilian diplomacy, I mean, has existed for 200 years. It's a very mature diplomatic body. And they have it clear. We should not like, we should not embrace China to the detriment of the US, or, you know, it's not a matter of chasing who's gonna be our new master. No, it's not.
It's making the most of
every
the
possibility.
existing order.
Yeah, it's a universalistic diplomacy, and it's been so for 200 years. 200 years. Of course, there are ups and downs. There are moments when a particular chief of state will be more aligned or inclined to. But currently, I think we are trying to balance, and it's a very difficult exercise. This balancing act of nowadays. But your question was
about Brazilian foreign policy.
Yes, and isolationism. That is a very interesting take, because I completely agree with you. It's of course, isolationism can be or can come to the benefit of those who practice it. Because if on the one hand, Brazil is not involved in major definitions or decision-making processes, and historically, Brazil hasn't been such an important player, such a decisive actor for many of the world's greatest questions. But as a benign legacy, Brazil has not didn't get involved with wars, regional wars, for 150 years now, and counting. More than 150 years, Brazil doesn't fight a war in its region. That's unbelievable. That simply doesn't happen. Brazil has fought World War I and II with supporting roles, not as the main actor, but in the region. The last one was the Paraguay War, which ended in 1870. So it's a very peaceful region of the world, and that's good. Or it should be good for businesses, for the development of our societies, for the environment. Not fighting wars is an asset. So this kind of isolationism put forth by Brazil can be seen against this more benevolent light. It could be a good thing. It could be depicted as something good for Brazil, but I would say, in addition to this, that over the last 3 decades or so, there is this drive of Brazil to integrate itself more and more to the world, especially from an economic perspective, but not only. The BRICS grouping could be seen as a platform for Brazil's projection. Mind you, Brazil has been attempting to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council since its inception. And before this, at the time of the League of Nations, Brazil has fought fiercely to become a permanent member of that body based in Geneva. So one can rightfully claim that for 100 years, Brazil has been trying to get a seat at the high table of international relations. And Brazil has been failing again and again. But then the BRICS grouping comes, and Brazil becomes a founding member. More than this, Brazil is kind of lending the B to the name of the grouping. Brazil's, the acronym has a direct reference to Brazil, B from Brazil. So Brazil is kind of a permanent member, or has this kind of a standing in the BRICS grouping, sort of a permanent member and founding member of the BRICS grouping. So for Brazil, it's also a means of garnering global recognition. It's a way to become more visible and identified with the set of major powers. It's the ladder Brazil is climbing up, the BRICS grouping. So it's important also in this regard. When Brazil proposes, along with China, a peace plan for the Ukraine war, I would go as far as to affirm that it doesn't matter whether it's effective or not. Does it really matter? But the very fact that Brazil is voicing out, alongside China, a peace plan, Brazil is being heard, that in itself is a precious asset for Brazil, for Brazilian diplomacy. We are being identified as a big dog, an important player in this game. So yes, Brazil is less isolationist these days, but still not a war making machine. Brazil is not a warring party. Won't be. Won't be. Brazil is a diplomatic power. As a former president of Brazil has once put it, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, President Cardoso, he said, Brazil is a soft power. I don't know if being concentrating lots of soft power will ever add up to, I mean, making you a power, a real power, but still, that's how he conveyed it. And we like to believe in it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Megan?
Yeah, I have a quick question about how Brazil sees the Trump administration sort of reincarnation of the Monroe Doctrine and its influence in, or the United States having influence over South America. I mean, obviously Brazil, as you said, is a little bit isolated from the region as a whole. Does this pose any sort of, I don't know, ideological, I mean, not threat necessarily, but sort of, I guess, trepidations against policy, and then also does this prove any sort of obstacle to Brazil voicing its power as a regional power or general international emerging middle power?
Okay, a good one as well. Trump doctrine, and thorny as well. So far, the US administration didn't mess with Brazil. The general level of tariffs imposed to Brazil is much lower than the one imposed to European nations, for instance, which comes as a surprise for me. And until now, we don't have many reasons to complain. I mean, the consequences or the collateral damage is not felt in Brazil yet, which doesn't mean we agree with the US current administration, not at all. But so far, President Lula da Silva, Brazil's current president, is self-restrained. Possibly he's under the guidance of our foreign ministry. They have been telling him, please, easy, don't react, just wait and see what's gonna happen next. And so the situation did not deteriorate as much as I myself thought it would. So far under control. But of course, it raises some concerns in as much as our neighboring nations, like, you know, you just mentioned Panama. I think you have cited. I thought of Panama, but yeah, it's what springs up, Panama. That's really a complicated scenario. I mean, when countries which neighbor Brazil, they start inviting extra regional powers to be in the region, this is a problem. The kind of attitude of Argentina's Javier Milei, this is a problem because he wants the US to be sitting and bring in their Marines and their military to the region, to South America's southern cone. That's a problem for Brazil because this is a demilitarized region overall, denuclearized region. No country in the region is even allowed to have warheads, nuclear warheads. So, this is from a common public goods perspective. This is one of our major assets, being a peaceful region. And we want South America to remain a peaceful region. No wars being fought around. So when President Trump evokes this doctrine, it's a problem. So far unfelt
practical consequences, but Brazil, of course, is monitoring the developments. So far, a lot of rhetoric, but not much on the ground. But we will keep an eye on what's coming up next, definitely.
Okay, wow. I think we've had a great discussion.
Beautiful one. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much for all your input, great presentation, and your wonderful comments and responses to the questions. That is so much appreciated. We feel very lucky to have you here with us today. And I'd like to thank the audience as well for great and very engaging questions. So thanks to you all. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.